Hello, and welcome to the Further podcast, where we explore the far reaches of the human experience, from missions to Mars to skydiving to blowing one's mind with psychoactive substances. These conversations offer insight into how these extreme experiences showcase the human spirit and just might teach us how to live our everyday lives a bit better. I'm your host, Haley Maria Duran, and I study the effects of psychedelics and other out there experiences on people's minds and brains. So there are a lot of people out there, myself included, who would probably say that their lives have benefited in some way from developing a somewhat consistent meditation practice, but many people don't really know what it would be like to live your life for a short time, at least, where you are completely sort of devoted to meditation, where that is the guiding compass of your life. But Sophie Jacobs does. She studied for a while in a Theravada monastery where she was considering becoming a Buddhist nun. So we get into her story of what led her to that rather beaten off the path route, and also what day-to-day is like living in a monastery. It's not really quite what a lot of people would expect, it sounds like. And she also tells us what it was like to integrate back into society after having lived as a monastic. In the book that she wrote, kind of chronicling that experience. So I met Sophie at a meditation retreat that was led by Dharma Gates. I highly recommend them. They are a nonprofit organization that sets up meditation retreats throughout the U.S. for young people, pretty low cost, and they have a variety of different traditions you can explore, lots of interesting people to meet there. So I highly recommend that if you are under 35 and interested in a meditation retreat, that you check them out. And finally, Further now has a Patreon page. If anybody is so interested in helping support the podcast, you could consider checking that out. There are multiple tiers that you can sign up for, and I would deeply appreciate that. I have a few more exciting podcasts lined up, so stick around. All right, so we're here with Sophie Jacobs. She is the author of The Intuition Experiment, which talks about her experience as a nun, studying meditation and subsequently leaving. And she just has a very interesting story. I ran into Sophie at a meditation retreat a few years back, and I just remember being completely captivated by her experiences, both in the monastery and out. So very excited to have Sophie on today. So I guess just to get started, what sort of experiences, I guess, led you to be interested in wanting to be a Buddhist nun or study meditation deeply?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Haley, and also I feel like you were equally captivating as a person when we went on that retreat back in January of 2023. I remember really resonating a lot with like the work that you do. For me in my journey, it's always a bit of a difficult thing to kind of like narrate because I think the thing with spiritual practice is that um, I'm sure as a child I had these experiences that were not really like accessible in language or for me to be able to put it into like the Buddhism category, but I was always very connected to like the outdoors and nature and just um this kind of contemplative way of life of just uh yeah, like just really curious about connection and the inner life, like the inner world. And so without even having a language for it when I was growing up, um it always sort of captivated me in different ways. So, you know, I remember people asking me, "Oh, so what do you want to do when you grow up?" And it became something like, "Well, I want to be like a doctor, but I also want to like fly around the world. I want to be like a pilot." So there's like these two opposing forces of just like wanting to explore this like exploration of like I want to go to places um that I haven't been to like kind of I want to open my mind, but I also want to heal. And so those two kind of things were always kind of with me, but that's how I described it at the time. And then when I went to college, I thought I would be this, a neuroscientist or a psychiatrist. And a lot of that was because of my upbringing. I come from a family of um, academics on my mom's side with like a really highly respected career. So it just made sense for me, like, oh, if I want this kind of healing profession and I want something highly respected, then makes sense that I would become something like a doctor, a psychiatrist. And, college was a lot of series of experimentations around trying something, figuring out doesn't resonate with me, and then moving on. And it kind of like took many iterations, but I remember specifically um, just feeling a little bit disillusioned by the um, by what it would take to become a doctor and what kind of healing that was offered, or like the philosophical aspects of being a doctor in like Western biomedical science. And a lot of this was informed both by experiences in classes that I took in anthropology, like medical anthropology, for example, and we really, you know, untangled the construct of healing in Western context, and that kind of like again like opened and expanded my world of like, oh, there's more to this than I thought. Like, it doesn't have to just look this way. And what ways does this system like not account for um, certain types of healing, like mystery illnesses or chronic symptoms, or people who have like treatment resistant depression, for example? Like, how do you explain that? And so I just became interested in understanding like the forgotten elements, or like the elements that couldn't be explained, or like the things that couldn't, that were kind of at the the edge of understanding in terms of the mind. And so, I kind of like went all the way back into psychology, but then was kind of jaded by like Western psychology, and at least the classes I took, it was a lot of like um, understanding of concepts, um, but not really like taking a look into like the architecture and the like, yeah, like the mind, and really exploring it for oneself. And so when I came across, um, you know, some some texts when I was younger, that influenced me as well. Like I remember also taking a trip at the age of 13 to Nepal, and a big part of the population practices Tibetan Buddhism. And just simultaneously, I was also like encountering world religions at the time in eighth grade. So I was reading Buddhist texts, but then it all came to life when I had this trip with my mom. And that trip really did a number on me. I honestly can't explain in words, because it was just the day-to-day living and just the energy that people emanated, that felt to me like there was something that was deeply nourishing or relatable to me in some way. And again, like couldn't quite describe it in words. Then when college came along, I was reading more Buddhist texts. I took some Buddhist classes, and then my sophomore year, um, I serendipitously decided to take some psychedelics at the same time that I was reading this book called Mindfulness for Beginners, or oh no, Mindfulness in Plain English by Bhante Gunaratnam. And it was this experience that like gave me this like very visceral direct impact of like the just the juiciness and the homecoming that it is to be in the present moment. And it was something so simple but something so profound, and it's something that like, yeah, be present, you can say that, but then when you actually have like the visceral raw experience of like complete presence, that was facilitated by the psilocybin, but then I also think the priming that I was able to do, understanding set and setting, reading that book, being in that environment, being around a friend that I trusted, being, I guess, in the causes and conditions that caused it to be that way, that that experience kind of tipped me over the edge of like understanding, like where no longer was I just like really taking things in from a cognitive level, but it was just like this viscerally felt experience of presence that I felt drawn to immediately and felt like, "Oh, this is what life is about." Like it was just this direct knowing and I like to say it's like you can't really go back from what you know. So, from that point on, I recognized that what had happened in that experience through doing some reading, through reading like Michael Pollan's work, um, and and papers and whatnot that there is some sort of correlation between what happens with a psilocybin experience and deep meditation. And so that drew me even further into deep meditation apart from my natural interests before. So after that experience, I just kind of like really snowballed into that practice and started to meditate daily. Nothing like too complex, but just like, 15 to 20 minutes of just like sitting. And I felt that that was really important to kind of cultivate and maintain. And then that built momentum. So, after college ended, it was right at COVID, a lot of upheaval for everyone, but the way it expressed in my life was I left college, uh I graduated a couple months after and then quickly did a startup job that my friend had founded and it quickly burned me out. But I remember like hosting like meditation groups like right before our scrums meeting, and I remember that being like the one thing that felt like me, that felt like what I wanted to be doing. And so I can get into this later, but long story short, my house burned down back in August of 2020, only a couple months after I started working, and that was a pivotal moment for me in my life. It was COVID, my house burned down, I was working this horrific, in my mind, startup job, just a lot of hours and not a lot of passion for it. So I decided to quit. I also only a couple months earlier, like broke up with my partner, and then my house burned down, and I was like, okay, well, all of these things are now cleared. So now what needs to come through next? And so it was actually my mom who was like, "Well, didn't you want to go to a monastery?" In that weird transition period in between me, the house burning down, and then the monastery. And you know, I said, "Yeah, I mean, I did, but honestly, like, why didn't I think of that?" And so I started just like pulling this list of monasteries in a spreadsheet and just randomly like cold calling or cold emailing them asking if I could like be a volunteer, be a resident there. So that's kind of like the long version of my why, like why I got into the practice.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there, like from your experiences as a kid, just, noticing nature and that being relevant to trying to understand more about how the mind sort of works. And then that like transitional sort of time in your life coupled with like your previously like really inspiring experience with mushrooms. It makes sense that you would look into it. So, I understand you ended up at a Theravada monastery. Do you want to tell us a bit about what that was like and maybe about that tradition for people who don't know?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Theravada Buddhism is like a one of three schools of Buddhism, and um, it is known to be kind of like the oldest or like the direct lineage back to the time of the Buddha, or at least that's how they kind of frame it in their view. One thing to note is that in Theravada Buddhism, there's an ideological difference between Theravada and like Mahayana, which is like mostly people hear the Zen schools, that's under Mahayana, and then Tibetan Buddhism. And one of those big differences is the difference between like a bodhisattva, like being a bodhisattva and taking a bodhisattva vow versus like arahantship, which is just like complete and full enlightenment. So, one of the main differences is that in Theravada school, they are working toward full and complete enlightenment, arahantship. And so the idea is not to come back into different rebirths and kind of take on the role of a bodhisattva, which is someone who is like almost fully enlightened, but vows to still remain in the world to help beings who are suffering. And so that's one ideological difference. On the day to day, it looks a little bit more different in terms of like the context of what precepts you take, and what kind of like the rules and structure are. So, there are only 2 meals a day versus I know in some monasteries you get three. That's one of like the rules in terms of not eating past solar noon. So we have 2 meals, and then like later in the day we have a very light snack or nothing at all. And part of the reason of that is because like in the text that was something that the Buddha outlined, like, and it gets very like it can be like a little bit confusing because in the Buddha's time there's different food, but in any case, part of the reason for that is because to deepen a meditation practice, it is helpful to not have like a full stomach. And so that's part of like deepening the practice. At least in the Theravada tradition. There's also, the Theravada tradition is interesting because there has not been many nuns that have, or bhikkhunis, as they say in this tradition, that have been able to ordain for nearly like 2,500 years. So there's been a huge die off of bhikkhunis, and only in the past, I would say like 30 or 40 years, has there been really a revival of this tradition for bhikkhunis or nuns. And so it's kind of a big deal, like, I guess, in the world of the Theravada Buddhism world, I guess, in terms of like women being able to ordain now. And that was a big part of kind of the culture of our monastery, was really trying to get women to uh, ordain in this tradition, since it was fairly new, and there were still some cultural barriers to ordaining for women. And so yeah, those are kind of like some differences that I can share for now.
So that's interesting. You didn't really know that much about the tradition. It sounds like going into it because you were just like, "Oh, whatever works, I'll try it out." And then, you're getting, it sounds like, a bit of pressure to ordain right away because it's like, "Oh, we need to have the women represented in the monastery." So,
Yeah, I mean,
wow.
I think like I kind of resonated with like funny enough, like Tibetan and Mahayana, but at the time that I was like looking for monasteries, um, I didn't feel like I had a solid practice in any one tradition. And so for me, it came down to like, what's the most practical and feasible place that I could go to that has women monastics, because I was really interested in understanding and living with women of wisdom. And it just so happened that this monastery that I went to, that was in the Theravada tradition and Bhikkhuni monastery, was an hour away from me, and like they were one of the first people to respond to me. So it was like it it was more of a practical decision than anything. So yeah.
Makes sense. So now that you're at the monastery and whatnot, like once you got there, what was it like? What was the day to day?
Yeah. So the day to day had a pretty solid routine, built into it. A lot of people have this perception that like if you go to a monastery you're just meditating all day, but that's not necessarily the case. There's definitely a lot of that baked in, but the way that monastery I went to was structured was that you would wake up at around 4:45. You would come in at 5 a.m. in the meditation hall, and you would begin to chant and then meditate. And then I would step out and, start to prepare breakfast. And then breakfast would be served at 7. And then by 8, we would have a work meeting. So figuring out what um, you were going to be doing for that morning period between that point in time and lunch, which was at 11. So I was the kitchen manager, or I became that over time, and that just meant that I was in charge of handling the food, the lunch for the monastics. And so I would be cooking from anywhere from like only 2 people to like 15 people. It was a relatively small monastery, but that was kind of what I was tasked doing. And then sometimes in the afternoon, I would be taking nuns to their doctor's appointment, or I'd be grocery shopping. Sometimes I would have some time to myself, and uh, in that case, I would be meditating or reaching out to a friend. Like I could still use my phone and reach out to people, or I'd be taking a walk, or I'd be reading a book from like the monastic library. And then by 7, there was chanting and meditation again, and then personal practice in the evening. So lights out were usually about 9. And, every week there would be certain programs that the monastery would put on for folks. And it was weird because it was like Zoom, or it was COVID time. So there was a lot of Zoom programming that I also had to help with, in terms of getting that sorted out, like Zoom tech support. That was the basic kind of structure of our day.
It's interesting because I think a lot of people, like you mentioned, like they think like Buddhist monastery and they're just like, oh, they're in there sitting all day and they're doing nothing but sitting. Oh, they're getting so deep into their practice. But it sounds like this was kind of like running a retreat center, sort of, kind of. I don't know. A place where people live
Yeah.
and, having that meditation interspersed with it.
And there were retreat times. Like there were like week-long retreats for the monastics, and then like a part of the monastic community helped the other monastics that were on retreat. And there would be times in between, like there's winter retreat period for 3 months, and then there's like something called Vasa, which is like the rains retreat, where the monks and nuns are advised to kind of like stay in their enclosures and not to travel out for 3 months. So that's more of a retreat period too. So it's just like in the longer span of like a year, there's like some uh opportunity for a deeper practice for sure.
I guess, like, what sort of impact did living in that environment have on your meditation practice? Like, how did it change over time?
So the impact for me was that it taught me to really just sit with everything. Like, don't just sit when you are happy or when you're sad and you want to pick me up. Sit with the grief, sit with the anger, sit with the confusion, sit with the turmoil, sit with the ease. And it was just like be with your experience no matter what. And it also taught me that the practice is not just on the cushion. The practice is this is the practice. Like like um there is no like practice on the cushion versus practice when you're cooking. I mean, you can differentiate it by like the formal aspect of seating, but really what I was taught was that by chopping vegetables and like knowing that you're chopping vegetables, that's the practice. It's like you're sensitizing yourself deeper and deeper into reality as it is. And you're training your mind to kind of rest with reality as it is, and in all of its ebbs and flows and shapes and curves. And you could never possibly do that if you were cherry picking your experience to just feel good. And so I think that was a big part of like my training, was to recognize that within me is, and this is I think one one of the chapters in the book that I wrote, um is like, my body is the earth, and within me are like, all of these different expressions of that, and like the internal weather of that. And that's all okay, and that the practice is training our mind to be okay with that. Because that's what the Buddha described as the suffering, is when there's this sense of not okayness with reality as it is. And so, yeah, regardless of like, I don't know if I necessarily feel like, um, the more time I spent there, like I think it ebbed and flowed in terms of like, my practice, in terms of concentration. But in terms of just like the equanimity of holding space for experience as it is, that was a very profound teaching. Very simple, but again, like profound and can be quite challenging at times.
So just being present to your experience, whatever it is, even if it's boring, interesting, not just using mindfulness to better experiences or whatnot. So yeah, that's cool. So I also understand that there were some downsides, I guess, to being a nun. What were those? What was that like?
Yeah, so this is just my personal experience. And I think for me, I had these kind of maybe like idealized versions of what it was like to be a monastic, and then um understanding that, the people that I looked up to are also human, and they are also practicing with their own um humanity. I think one of the things that I at the time um had difficulty with was really not falling into aversion around my humanity and all that um entailed, like around like maybe the anger or like the grief that came with being human, and the feeling like I needed to overcome these afflictions so that I could finally be um at peace. And it was like this mind fallacy of if then that. Which we're always playing with the mind, right? It's like, oh, well, if I get my PhD, then I'll be happy. If I get my
All that.
partner, then I'll be happy, you know? And for me, how it manifested, and this is the thing about going to the monastery, is that the mind will play the same tricks, but it'll just be a little bit more subtle, or like it'll be more refined. So it's like in my mind, it was like, oh, if I go to the monastery, then I'll be happy. And it's like using the monastery as this like idea and concept that will give me happiness. And that's still an external thing. Now, it can be great support for you, but at the end of the day, like John Kabat-Zinn said, wherever you go, there you are, even a monastery. So, your suffering will like follow you, like the shadow, in the sun, and as long as uh, we can kind of the mind can attach to anything, um, in any context to kind of perpetuate that. And so that was one of the things that I struggled with, was like, oh wow, these people are like human. They experience anger too. And one way that that manifested for me was just like having a really hard time expressing my feelings to their full extent, like not feeling safe sharing how I really felt, because I felt that maybe that was like not wise, foolish, and it was playing this like good pious girl complex that I had grown up with in terms of like the schooling. So that was also like my conditioning coming into play. But then also I think after a certain point, I realized that I feel like there was something that needed to be expressed in me, kind of like as a creative force, that couldn't be channeled if I were to kind of continue down the track of being a nun, especially in the Theravada tradition. Now I know in some Zen traditions you're able to kind of like use art as a practice, you're even able to play instruments. I know in Plum Village they have like a band. But in the Theravada tradition, that's one of the precepts, is not to engage in entertainment. And so part of that is not to listen to music and not to like play an instrument. And so that was a big part of how I grew up. I actually grew up playing the violin and then later the viola, and it connected me to my grandparents, to friends, and just a huge part of like my upbringing. And I've always considered myself more of a creative and artistic person, and it felt like being in that space at that time was starting to become detrimental to kind of like these longings that I had within me that I just needed to trust. And if it was going to be a foolish decision, oh well, but at least I needed to kind of like follow that through um to its completion. And that was just my personal experience. I think people need different things at different times, and that's just kind of like what was starting to bubble up in my experience as I, continued writing every day at the monastery, recognizing, oh, I think there's a book in me here, there's some things that I want to do in the world that I don't think I would be able to if I were just strictly a monastic. So, what I envisioned for my life was kind of having this kind of bridge between monastic life and lay life. Like, what could it look like for me to kind of still live a contemplative life and also include that creativity without like attaching or grasping onto me and mine, and like using the wisdom and the teachings to inform my creative practice instead of completely like dismissing it from my experience when it was really something that was like that I knew in my heart was a longing that I wanted to fulfill.
Wow. There's a lot there to think about. It's interesting because like immediately I don't see there being an incompatibility between being creative and having like a mindfulness practice, but it just sounds like within the structure of the monastery that was kind of like, I don't know, the implicit assumption is that, to have a really mindful life, you have to like not be creative, which that's interesting. Hmm.
I think there are like other ways to be creative within the context of the monastery. Um, but yeah, at the same time, it kind of felt like there was a real emphasis of like letting go of all the coping mechanisms that keep us kind of stuck in habitual patterns of running away from experience. And so part of that entertainment part is like, music is a form of like getting dopamine. And we can use music as a way to um, kind of like amplify the way we feel, which can feel kind of good, like we're trying to get something good out of it. Um, and it can distract us from how we're feeling. And so there's a bit of like an edge there. I also personally and in other traditions um there's a different kind of orientation to it, but and this is part of the Theravada view. A lot of it is about renouncing and letting go of the worldly life, of those worldly things that keep us like engaged in it. Because if we keep being involved and kind of like engaged in that, and there's a graspiness, there's an attachment to that, and what once was like a mindful practice can quickly become like just another coping mechanism. And so on the one hand I understand that, but on the other hand, like it's just something that like brings me so much joy, a lot of, like, skillful qualities of mine that I'm not ready at this point to give it up. Yeah.
Makes sense. So eventually you left the monastery. How did your experience and like your time in there kind of shape your life afterwards?
Yeah. I left in 2021, like, late October of that, so it's been a couple years now. Um, it was a really difficult transition for me on a number of levels. Um, It was quite difficult because having like that sort of training is not something that's like quite normative in our society. So it's something that was like difficult for me to kind of explain to people exactly what had occurred and what transformed within me in my mind, in the ways that I was like perceiving myself. Um, yeah, these sort of like practices of inner transformation don't necessarily have like a tangible quality that you can touch, but there's some sense of it being really profound and real and true. And I think I struggled a lot with my identity at that point in the transition around, I shaved my head, I wore white robes, I took on the name of Panyatara, and that process is kind of in a sense teaching you that that was exactly what happened to you when you were born. Like, you got put in like some sort of like dress that you didn't choose. You got named something that you didn't choose, and it was like something that got created from someone's mind, so it's a construction, and then it got put onto you, and then you internalize it, and then you think that's you, that's like the essential you. So it's like that process was happening to me in real time while I was like developed enough to be mindful of it, and it was freaking crazy bonkers. So then also like disrobing and then going back to Sophie, going back to that like identity and construct that I had so like cultivated over like 23, 24 years at that point. It was mind-boggling to kind of step back into that place and that identity and recognize like, oh wow, there's something here that's like there was some spaciousness around it, or some like incongruencies of like, how could I both be Panyatara but then also be Sophie, and like playing with the paradox of like, wow, I'm like both now, but like I'm not, and just like the whole like concept of um the essential self kind of just like completely just uh from a direct and visual experience was like, this can't possibly be true. And so it was at the same time that it was difficult, it was also liberating in the sense that like, oh, I can like play. Like there's some playfulness in like Sophie that can be expressed, and that's totally fine, and it doesn't have to be like super kind of like rigidly bound like that. I can kind of see what works for me in any given moment, and I can pick something up and then put something down, and that's okay. And so that was part of the process of like leaving. But then another big crucial part of it was I had been writing during the monastery, and when I left the monastery, I was very dead set on writing a book. And part of that was due to my experiences at the monastery, receiving particular teachings, um, and really trying to understand like what is real and true for me. Um, you know, whether it is Theravada Buddhism or not, or something completely different. And so I had been writing a lot during the monastery, and at that point I kind of knew, "Ooh, I think I want to write a book here about like what is, inner knowing and how I'm coming to understand it." And then when I left, I was like, no, I definitely need to keep exploring this. So that kind of became like the centrifugal force of my life after that point, was just uncovering and exploring and investigating like, what are the ways in which we can start to connect with ourselves at a deeper level? How can we come home to ourselves at a deeper level? What gets in the way? And it took me on like a beautiful and sometimes bloodied journey of of uncovering that, of just being in the question. So just kind of like using my life as this kind of experiment, as this question, and then seeing what gets unraveled and writing from that place. So it was really cool, kind of in the moment. Felt like kind of like a meditation, coming back to like this, like a meditation object. Okay, the body, the four elements, like what's here now, what's here now, what's here now, or just depending on like where I was paying attention to, like whole like bodies and frames of knowledge got opened up that I could explore and write from. So that was a big part of my
Mhm.
transition out was writing this book too.
It's very interesting. It sounds like there is like a time where you were almost seeing yourself from like a third person perspective and like observing your personality and then like being like, oh, I'm gonna like amplify sort of this aspect of it or not, but I'm also like still here and still present regardless. So that's really intriguing. And then this period afterwards, it sounds like very experimental in a sense that you were just like trying all these different sort of things and practices. Could you tell us a bit more about some of them?
Yeah. So part of like the experimentation was like precisely that. I did not have a plan of like what was going to be uncovered. So one of the fun stories that I wrote in my book was about this chance encounter with this woman in St. Louis who had trained in TRE, which is trauma release exercise. And it was funny because I remember one of the many places that I lived in after the monastery experience was St. Louis, which is where I'm originally from. And I just, happened to notice that there was a business in my neighborhood that opened up called the Daman Healing Center. And I was like, oh, healing, interesting. Curious about that. It just caught my eye. And so I went on their website and found that there was someone named Susan who did this thing called Thierry. Never heard of it. I was like, interesting. Like, essentially, the idea was that you can kind of induce this like tremor response in your body that will then be able to kind of like shake out this kind of energy that's stored in your body. I think like muscles or fascia or something of that sort. And so, like as you're trembling, you're kind of releasing this pent up energy that got stored during that moment of trauma response when you froze and you couldn't like release it. Animals do it all the time, and for some reason, like in our culture today, we kind of view it as like anxiety or like some sort of weakness, but it's actually like a very important process in releasing. So, in any case, I saw that, I was intrigued. I texted her, and um, she texted me back, but something happened along the way where our wires were crossed and we didn't reach out. And then, like several months later, I was getting an Uber ride from my workplace, and it just so happened that Susan was my Uber driver. And it was just like, okay, I guess I need to talk to you about this modality. Like, so it was this like fun chance encounter of meeting Susan, talking to her, and then she gave me a free session, and I kind of interviewed about the modality she uses. I got to try it on for myself, and that's one of the ways that was like just a really fun journey that I got to be on. Of like, okay, what happens if I set this intention to scope out anything that might resonate with this idea of inner knowing, of intuition, and then see what comes of it. And that was one fun way that that evolved, because part of what I was trying to understand was um like those practices of clearing and releasing energy, what what is available to us now, like what how can we like really like how can we better connect with our bodies and our minds? Well, one practice is to like release all this pent up energy. um so that was that was a cool kind of coincidence or
What was the
synchronicity.
experience actually like with the trauma release exercises?
So it was kind of like working out in a weird way. So like she gave me like very specific instructions for ways that I needed to like um put a lot of like pressure on certain muscle groups. So I remember one of the practices was like you have to like do like a um heel stretch, like using your foot to like the front of a wall and then just like stretching your heel and like tiring it out. So a lot of it was about like doing specific practices that targeted specific muscles that then tired them out. And then what you would do is that you would get on the floor on a comfortable position with mat. You could have a blanket if you wanted, and then you would like splay your uh, your legs out and kind of have them be have your feet touch kind of like that, and then you'd slowly kind of like inch your legs and your knees like closer and closer together, and it would start to kind of like do this. It would start to kind of like tremble until when you got closer and closer it would like do that, and then once it started to really tremble then you would just kind of like let it tremble. Oftentimes like what can happen is that the mind can get in the way and like feel that like something is like overwhelming and out of control, and you're kind of like preparing your mind, the parts of you that fear that, to kind of you know, be okay with this process. That's it's totally normal. It's part of the process. Like nothing bad's gonna happen. In fact, you don't even need to like create a story in your mind of like what's happening, why is this happening to my body? That you can just kind of let yourself shake and that it's a normal thing. It's kind of destigmatizing that movement. That's part of the practice. And I just remember feeling like a lot of like tingliness afterwards, like um this sense of like expansion and lightness and tingliness once I went through that practice. I did about like 20 minutes of this like really intense shaking. So it can be quite intense. And they usually tell you to like drink a lot of water and kind of like be gentle with yourself for that day because it can be kind of quite an exhausting process. But like in a good way. And that's part of like this somatic sense of like what it's like to feel good in your body, is this lightness, is this ease, is this kind of tingliness, like this tingly aliveness. Those things like help you feel connected, help you feel alive, help you kind of uh, know yourself. And so, yeah, that's what I experienced, and it was a really cool but unexpected process.
It's interesting because I think there's like a component to that that like a practice like meditation doesn't necessarily teach you, or at least it sounds like that.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think there's some things that like, um, if you're in a highly activated state, for example, or like you just kind of accumulated a lot of energy from your day and you're noticing kind of like this restlessness. One of the ways that you can help prepare yourself for meditation is to do something like that. And recognizing that maybe the body is needing some release and some um, like to get that charge out, and then it might be more settled for kind of a deeper practice, because the way that meditation goes is we go from coarser objects to subtler ones, and oftentimes if you're feeling like agitation or restlessness, all those things, you might need to kind of like soothe those parts of yourself before you can really go in deeper. And so we kind of like meet ourselves where we're at, so to speak.
Mm. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
In the book, you say that you encourage experimentation with embodied awareness before trying anything else. Like, what are some ways that people could sort of experience that more besides from like the trauma release exercises that we mentioned?
Yeah. It's a good question. I know first and foremost, like one of the most simplest things that you can do is just like ask your body, like what kind of movement would you like to make now? You know, and letting your body just like do whatever movement. And obviously like you probably need to create like a safe container for that. Maybe in your room, you know, closing your door, if like making a space that feels comfortable for you to like do a movement that might feel weird. Um So that's definitely one, and you could pair that with music that you resonate with. Like, what mood am I feeling? And so, like, how do I want to like express myself? So part of um the way that I've, you know, connected to this is through ecstatic dance, which is essentially just like moving how you want to based on the music that's present. Another one being, I think, you know, really like connecting to like the four elements. So, you know, and this can be in a formal seated meditation, but it can also be just like being aware of like the saliva in your mouth, like that water element, like the perspiration, being aware of the pressure of your feet on the floor and like really grounding, being aware of the heat in your body, being aware of like the breath between your nostrils or like the wind, and recognizing that all of those elements like are expressions of you. And so like how can you possibly be alone in that sense if your experience of the senses is channeled through the four elements and the four elements is all around us. So that's a fun one. And I think also just like, if you have a history of trauma, like this is probably going to look a little bit different in terms of like, you know, part of the joys of play and experimentation come from having like a regulated nervous system. So there might need to be like some practices and like commitments in place of like honoring your body's needs in terms of regulation. I think that's for everyone, but especially people who have like trauma histories, there's a history of dysregulation. And so coming back into that regulated state, um in IFS, internal family systems, which is like what I am currently training in. There's these, things called the 8 C's, um, which is kind of descriptive of someone's like most authentic self, or, in spiritual or wisdom traditions, it's like the no self or the Atman or the soul, and there's these 8 descriptions, and it's like calm, compassionate, centered, creative, clear, courageous, confident. Um, I might be missing one, but that's the essential gist. And, we can only, like, that can only come through when there's this like friendliness towards all the parts of ourselves, and when we are able to regulate or co-regulate with another being that's regulated. And so there might be certain like somatic practices that you can do, like the brain loves bilateral stimulation, so just like tapping on your chest, or even doing some like EFT tapping on the specific meridian points that open up these energy channels, right? And then wiring that with a certain phrase that you'd like to send to yourself, that's kind. It can look like kind of stimulating like the upper ear, which is like connected to the vagus nerve, which connects you to your parasympathetic nervous system. So there's a lot of different ways that you can explore it. And my suggestion is just to like, if you feel like curious or there's some sort of like inkling to go to one practice, just stay with that and just try it for like, I don't know, 3 minutes a day. Like, part of this process is like not overwhelming your system, um because that can often just cause like a backlash.
So true. Um, it sounds like for you, at least when you were in the monastery, like you had like a writing practice. I would almost describe it as. What was that like? Like, how did you get really into writing?
I got into writing because I felt alone in my experience, and I just like wanted a way to like um in a funny way, it's like when you write, it's like you're kind of like releasing whatever is going on and whatever you're experiencing and witnessing, and how you're translating that into words on the page, and it feels very like cathartic to like hold space for yourself in that way, especially when you feel like no one else can hold space for you in the same way. And so I think it was just out of feelings of like um loneliness that really brought that to me, especially as I like really explored my inner world. um but I often like felt also just really curious and I guess excited about like how can you use words as a way to kind of point the finger towards some sort of truth or your experience. um and so, but like without kind of, I guess like the way that I would say it is like being a little bit abstract, like how abstract can you be without like completely losing someone? So part of that was just like it felt like writing was another form of meditation. It would just like, I would let myself do this stream of consciousness. And it was really curious and surprising as to like what came out of that. And like the things that would come up. And so it felt also like a way that I could practice just kind of like that that quality of like stillness in action, like just letting the pen write and then seeing what would come out of it, and just being I really like the process of being surprised too at like what comes through.
It's such a like a good attitude to have towards writing instead of like I find like I don't write really creatively, but like just like even writing like research papers, sometimes I'll be very like focused on, oh, does this sound right? Does that sound right? Like in terms of like the phrasing, but just being like, okay, let's see how I write. And not judging oneself so much. That's yeah, I feel like I could learn to do more of that. So that's an interesting way to write. So okay, last couple questions. So through like all this sort of experiment focusing on intuition, do you feel like your understanding of intuition sort of changed through the process, and what does intuition sort of mean to you today, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a great question. It definitely, changes. I think the way I see it today is that I think what I come back to like the really basic truths of like Buddhism, which is really funny because it's like I started out with this like the Buddhist teachings and wisdom, and then I was like, no, I want to follow my intuition. Like I understand it's related to Buddhism, but this feels like something I want to do like beyond and apart from Buddhism. And then I was like, oh, I'm getting attached to intuition. Like, um, I I need, and then realizing like, oh, it's my craving for like knowing that actually obstructs the knowing from happening. And so it brought me into like a more deeper understanding of like these basic truths of Buddhism of like craving leads to suffering, and like what is the path out of that. And so I think part of that exploration of intuition was just understanding for myself like what is the path toward not just like happiness in a very short-lived way, but like true liberation of heart and mind. Um and feeling like at the time that intuition was a way for me to understand like how I could trust myself and make decisions. But these days I'm less focused on the word intuition, how to like properly operationalize it, and more interested in just like the practices that the Buddha taught of like letting go and of equanimity, and like really really deepening my practice in the Dharma, because I find that when I really go in that direction, um then there's a way in which like there never was a time when it wasn't me. There's this I think there's this idea that I have that I was like either aligned or I wasn't. And now I'm like more so relating to it as like either there's suffering or there's not, and circumstances and conditions and those things, like there is some element that you can influence, but there's not like I'm not God and I can't play God and I can't use my intuition experiment to create like the dream life that I want in the external world. Like shit falls apart, it comes together again, and then shit falls apart. So what you gonna do when it falls apart? Um, Not to use my experiment as a way to like find your, forever bliss and happiness where like nothing will. You ever again. So that's, and so the way that I see intuition now is that it's a sensation that arises when there's there's something in like the felt environment that's leading you toward an experience that helps you um in some way around getting freer. And it might not necessarily be a savory experience. It might be, oh, I'm getting this hit that maybe I need to break up, right? But in that breaking up, there's a letting go. And in that letting go, there's a freedom. And in that freedom, some new opportunity might come about because you you had the audacity to kind of trust in that impulse. But I feel like that impulse only comes when, there's a regulated nervous system, when like all your basic needs are being met. And like for me specifically, what I found is like when you're practicing these qualities um of love and non-attachment, because that feels like the 8 C's, what I was saying before, like um the soul, the the way that we inhabit and embody the world that feels most at peace and most alive. And so yeah, that's kind of how I'm orienting to it now. I will say, like, I'm also using a lot the IFS model to help me understand intuition. Like intuition being this kind of impulse that arises when we're in self energy, which has these like right 8C qualities. So there's so many ways of thinking about it, and I feel like I'm just like constantly nerding out about all the ways that I can think about it. But at the end of the day, I think my practice is starting to narrow down more into like just the basics of like the Dharma and like just, getting on with practice.
It's interesting that you had to go through that whole evolution of, being a nun, being extremely committed, living in that sort of world, experimenting with a bunch of different practices, and now you're kind of back to what you were initially were interested in. Um, it's kind of like you found the middle path, I suppose.
Yeah, I know. It's funny. I'm like, it reminds me of like the path of the Buddha in the sense that like he would like have these experiments where it'd be like, okay, well, what would it be like if I were an ascetic? Would this bring me less suffering? What would it be like if I like completely engaged in my senses? Would this bring me less suffering? And it's just like going on all these like experiments, so to speak, and recognizing like in all of that there's this middle way um that that can only, or at least in the story of the Buddha, that, it needed those extremes to actually understand the middle way. So, and this is something that I'm coming into awareness about, as well as like Thich Nhat Hanh says it. I'm sure other teachers say it, is like, we in a way like we should be grateful of our suffering, because without it there would be no liberation. Like that is exactly the the nourishment, like the compost, so to speak, that that enables us to wake up. And so there's, even in the suffering of it, like we have an opportunity, we have a chance. How great is that? Yeah. Yeah, and so in a way, I don't regret that kind of journey, but it's funny that I'm coming kind of in a way full circle, or the way I like to see it is like it kind of just spirals, like things just like keep spiraling and keep, kind of coming back to you as lessons, but each time that you do it, it's like there's a level of maturity that you didn't have before that you can glean.
Well, thank you for sharing all these insights with us. It's been quite interesting. So, where can people, I guess, keep up with your work and your adventures today? Do you have plans for another book, maybe?
Not for now. I'm mostly
Okay.
like really interested in helping other people on their own like journeys, so to speak, of um, you know, helping them to reconnect to themselves and life, and using Buddhist insights and IFS and my journey through the intuition experiment to help with that. So I lead groups and do one-on-one work. I'm currently leading something called Queer Circling group, which circling is like basically like mindfulness, you can say, but in social relationships. And I host a queer affinity space for that. So if anyone's interested in that, they can, reach out to me in my email, sophie.floatintoit, like UIT, at gmail.com. But then also I have a Substack. Like I share my writing still. I still like to write. And it's called Snail Mail. So if you look that up, you'll probably find it. And I'm also on Instagram, like Flow Into It again, and have a website, flow-intoit.com. So yeah, those are some variety of ways that you can connect with me. And yeah, I enjoy kind of like this uh, balance of like writing, creating in that way, but then also helping other people like on the path, because it's true what the Buddha said, like the whole path is friendship. And I think part of my work is building alliances and friendship with people who are also interested in taking these steps toward, liberation or freedom, or freedom from the affliction or the suffering. And so yeah, you can say it in a variety of different ways, but building friendship and guidance along the path. It's like we all walk each other home. So I appreciate that I get to do that in my work.
Well, thank you for doing all that. All right. Sophie Jacobs, everyone, author of The Intuition Experiment.